Well. So let's talk about some serious news. Some real news. The news that people actually care about. So I figured I'd give a brief commentary about Apple switching over to ARM. As you may know, I am an Apple sheeple to the core. I own so much Apple. I own all the Apple. Like literally, I'm recording this literally on a Mac Pro. My demo machine over here is an older MacBook Pro. My daily driver is a newer MacBook Pro. I have a HomePod. I have AirPods. I have an Apple TV. I have an iPhone 11 Pro. So I am fully in the Apple universe. Fully in the Apple universe. And so I figured I'd talk a little bit today about, as a tech professional, what I care about with Apple going over to ARM. And I have to say, the TLDR or the TLDW is nah. My overall impression of Apple going over to the ARM processor is nah. But I figured we would talk about it today and talk about some of the things that are going on in the technology world and where we're going in the future of technology and IT and all of these different hardware things. So basically, when we talk about going over to the ARM processor, it's important to understand that Apple's been using the x86 or the Intel processors now. For like 10 or so years. So they had their own PowerPC processors. So they had their own processors in the past. And then a number of years ago, a decade or so ago, they switched over to using Intel processors. And now the idea is for their laptops and their desktops, that type of thing, that they're then going to switch back to using their own processors, and they're going to be using something called an ARM processor. Now, why the ARM processors are so cool in the technology world is that basically this company ARM licenses out the designs for processors. They get a royalty fee whenever a processor is produced. But the cool thing is, is that manufacturers, vendors such as Qualcomm or vendors, Samsung, Apple, the whole nine yards. Basically, they can get the schematics, they can get all the design information for particular types of ARM processors, and then they can modify those ARM processors as need be. So depending on what particular device that you're trying to create, you can kind of like pick, basically copy and paste. So kind of like the copy and paste in the hardware world. Okay, we'll take a little bit of this and we'll take a little bit of that. We don't care about any of this. And then the idea is you can create a specific processor that does exactly what you needed to do. So ARM processors have been a big thing in the mobile world for 20 years at least. And the big thing with ARM processors is that they were initially designed to be very power efficient. So if you go back about 20 years ago, you look at Intel and you look at ARM processors, in many ways, they weren't even really competitors in any way that you would imagine them to be, because basically ARM was for all these new little devices that were coming out, things like Blackberries, right? Those little Blackberries, PDAs, that type of thing. And Intel processors were for desktops and notebook computers and that type of thing. So basically, if you just simply need to be able to receive email, send text messages, you need compute. You do need a processor. But you're not going to be playing World of Warcraft or anything on that little device. And so ARM basically had its little niche. So it was for all the mobile devices. And then Intel was for all the more powerful devices, basically something that you could plug into a wall and you could burn a lot of electricity. Well, as time goes by, basically the ARM processors have gotten better and better and better and better. And weirdly, the Intel processors just haven't kept up as well. Intel really hasn't had good competition. AMD kind of comes in. It comes in for a little while and it goes out for a little while. But Intel hasn't had a lot of great competition. And so one of the issues with Intel is they've kind of sat on their laurels. They got to a very good place. They started milking the market. They started making as much profit as they could off the market. And then they've kind of stagnated. The curious thing, though, is ARM has kept getting better and better and better and better and better and better. And I think one of the real reasons is because they focused on that mobile world. And if we look at it, mobile has become more and more important over the past 20 years. Again, if you look back in the day with Blackberries, now when Blackberries came out, C-levels, CEOs, that type of thing would have Blackberries, managers would have Blackberries, high-level professionals would have Blackberries. But basically nobody else would, right? BlackBerry was like, ooh, you're fancy enough to have a BlackBerry. Well, now, again, everybody has smartphones. So everybody has smartphones, and then everybody got tablets, and then now we have all these computers inside our smart TVs and all that kind of stuff. And so ARM was just happened to be in that one of those really good positions where the niche that they focused on started exploding, starting to become ever more useful, ever more needed in the modern world. And I think as ARM has gone along with that, we now get to the point where ARM processors are actually very, 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 very good, and they're power efficient, and vendors can license how to make the processors and then design them however they see fit. And so going into the future, into the 2020s, ARM processors actually look like a hell of a lot better bet than the old Intel processors. One of the big things too, when you start looking at the difference between ARM processors and Intel processors, is that ARM processors are much more modular, right? If you ever actually take a look in white pages or anything's explaining ARM processors, one of the things with the ARM processors is they'll talk about all the different components. So they'll talk about the graphic component, or they'll talk about the high power components and low power components. And basically, they talk about all these different components that come together for the processor. And so one of the interesting things is when companies or when vendors are designing devices, then they can focus on, again, the exact type of processor that they need. So if they need low power, they can focus on a particular type of cores. If they need high power, they're doing a lot of graphics, they can focus on different cores. If they need a device that needs low power and high power, they can have some low power cores and some high power cores. And so basically the vendors can come in and they can mix and match all of these components to make a processor that does what they need it to do. So Samsung can have a processor that does whatever it is that Samsung needs it to do. Apple can create a processor that does what the iPhone 11 Pro needs to do. Right? Basically vendors can come in and they can figure out exactly what they need. If you look over at the Intel world, there's much more just the push of just the big, massive, like general compute CPU. So you have the CPU. It's a very powerful CPU. But being a very powerful CPU, the issue is yes, it can run the latest Grand Theft Auto or the latest video games or whatever. But the problem is that it takes as much power, or it takes more power in order to be able to push like email, right? So if you need to do low power tasks, the CPU still requires a tremendous amount of power, and so it's just a less modular system. So I think this is interesting as we start looking into the future about where things like CPUs are going to go. And when you see Apple deciding to go with ARM processor, I think it actually makes a lot of sense. And if you really look at it, it's a process that's been going on for about 20 years. Again, an important thing to be thinking about in the modern world is the whole question of what is a computer, right? So a lot of people nowadays, they'll say things like, well, all computers use Intel. All computers use x86 or whatever type processors. But one of the questions you have to look at is, again, what is a computer? Is a smartphone a computer? Is a tablet a computer? Is a smart TV a computer? Is an Apple TV a computer? Is a Roku a computer? Whole nine yards. And one of the interesting things that we start to see is that when we start thinking about computers in a wider context than servers, desktops, and laptops, is that the ARM processor really has taken over just a massive amount of the computing world. Again, when you start thinking about smartwatches and you think about smartphones and you think about tablets and you think about all of these different devices that are now using those ARM processors, and they're doing very well. They're actually running very well, and that's one thing that Apple has looked at. Is with their higher end lines of these ARM processors, the A13 Bionics and so on and so forth, is they are actually getting performance now at par with Intel processors, but they can design the processors, again, to be more power efficient and do the things that they needed to do. So a lot of people right now, like there's this idea, like Apple is making this major switch. They're ditching Intel. They're doing a major switch to ARM. Well, not really. Basically, they've been using ARM. They've been using ARM for the past 12 years, at least. All they're doing now is they use ARM processors for the iPhone. And then they use ARM processors for the iPads. And then they use ARM processors for the Apple TV. And then they use ARM processors for the watch. And then they use ARM processors for the HomePod. And now basically they've been designing, they've been working with ARM processors for a long time now, over a decade now. And so basically at this point, they're just getting to the migration point where it's like, well, we've already been able to create all the silicon. We've been able to do all the design. We've been able to do all the things that we need up until this point for all these other devices. So why don't we just switch over to a laptop? Again, when you start thinking about what's the difference between a laptop and a tablet, Nowadays, there's not a whole hell of a lot of difference. So if Apple can simply design the exact processor that they need for their latest generation of laptop, why not do that? And then once you've done that for long enough, again, you go to the iMac line, and then once you do that long enough, then you go to the Mac Pro line, right? Because they're already building all of the processors anyway. One of the big issues I've heard too with Intel is there's been a lot of snarkiness, a lot of snarkiness by reviewers about the idea that Mac's new Apple computers come out are basically underpowered, right? So if you look at the price point for Apple computers and then you look at the processors that the Apple computers use, there seems to be a disparity. A lot of people say it's a disparity, right? Oh, they're underpowered, overpriced, underpowered. There's an argument to be made, or there's a point to be made, is that one of the issues Apple is having with using Intel is that Intel has been falling down in a lot of different ways, from price and performance standpoint, but also production capability. All right, so one of the things to be thinking about in the Apple world is Apple likes to produce one type of computer or a few types of computers, right? They're not like Dell. They're not like Dell. Dell, whew, like them or hate them. Dell puts out just thousands of models of computers, right? Even if they're in the same line, like if you buy what you think is the same Dell computer a couple of months later, many times it'll have different internal components to it, right? Because basically what Dell does, Dell says, okay, here's the model. This model has so much RAM, has so much graphics, has this type of CPU, has this whatever else, right? And then if a vendor can't get them all the equipment they need, or if there's a little hiccup, basically what they look at is they look at all those numbers, and then they just basically create a new version of that laptop that has the same, still has 16 gigs of RAM, still has an AC Wi-Fi, still has all this stuff. It just simply happens to use a little bit different hardware. And again, Dell doesn't care. Dell doesn't care. If you're buying it from, if you're buying from Dell, you don't really care if the laptop that you bought today is identical to the laptop your friend bought 2 months ago, as long as you get the same amount of RAM, as long as you get the same size SSD, as long as you get the same AC or AX or whatever Wi-Fi, right? Well, in the Apple world, right? The Apple world is massively about standardization, 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 standardization. And so apparently one of the big problems with Intel is that they have not been able to produce in the numbers that many times Apple has required. So when Apple comes out with a new Mac line of some sort and they need millions of processors, one of the issues, one of the bottlenecks is that Intel is not working fast enough to actually ship out all those processors. And so then Apple gets hamstrung because of that, right? Again, they get strung up by their own suppliers. I think about this. I knew somebody who was actually working on the Azure deployments. And when I say the Azure deployments, I'm not talking about a company that was deploying for Azure. I'm talking about the actual Microsoft Azure deployments, right? And so he was talking about what it's like to project manage when you were deploying hundreds of thousands of servers. And so one of the things that he actually had to deal with is he had to deal with Intel, and he would actually get the supplier information from Intel so that he could track the production of all of these different CPUs and make sure that everything was being manufactured in time. So if there was any slowdown in the manufacturing process, if there was any backlog in logistics, he was actually getting the reports directly from Intel, so he knew how to best build out these massive data centers. Because if you need 500,000 chips, if you need 500,000 processors, and for some reason Intel can only provide 400,000, you run into a lot of issues. And so Apple has been running into a lot of problems apparently with Intel, where basically they're waiting for Intel to get these chips out. Intel is kind of taking it a little relaxed, kind of not being up on everything, being a little slow to deliver. And so that's one of the things that Apple has had a problem with, is they feel like they've been massively constrained. So if we really look at the benefits of Apple going over to ARM, I think honestly the biggest thing is that Apple is now going to basically control almost all of their supply line. So whether it's the case, whether it's the keyboard, whether it's the screen, whether it's the CPU, they can now control that entire supply line and then figure out what is required to get all the logistics to come together to actually produce all of the systems that they want to produce. So I think that's really the major benefit there for Apple, and I'll be curious to see how that comes down to the end user. Basically, are we getting more upgrades of processors faster simply because Apple knows what their timelines are? And so they can start designing and they can start manufacturing chips and not have to rely on a company such as Intel. Now, if we start looking at it, the question then becomes, what is the good for the end user, right? So, okay, so I'm going to go out there. I'm thinking about buying a Mac. Is having an ARM processor going to make Macs amazingly better? Probably not. Probably. I wouldn't wait to buy a Mac. I wouldn't wait to buy an ARM Mac unless I was a YouTube tech reviewer or something like that. I think most of the benefits with the ARM processors are really going to be coming from more like logistics type things. And I think maybe going into the future, we'll start to see some benefits from the ARM processors. But I don't think the end user is actually going to get a lot of performance difference. Because again, when you really think about it, if you look at a modern computer, right? Most modern computers, especially if you're buying an Apple computer, they do good enough. They do good enough. Again, the computer, this is my demonstration computer, right? This is a 2013. It's a 2013 MacBook Pro. And honestly, completely honestly, if I was not a content creator that was recording at 1080p, 60 frames per second, and doing a whole bunch of other things, I could still use this computer. This computer is perfectly fine. It is now 7 years old. Now, 7 or possibly 70 or more years old. And when I look at the computer, it works fine. It can encode in 4K. It can encode in 1080p, 60 frames per second if I really wanted to. It can do 99.9999% of the things that I needed to do. Why I own something like a Mac Pro is because with the Mac Pro, it has so much extra power that as a content creator, it allows me to do things more efficiently. So like with the Mac Pro, what I love, what is a great thing, is I can literally be recording a video while I'm encoding videos. And so I can have that complete workflow. Normally if I had a MacBook Pro or one of my older Macs, basically if I wanted to encode a video, I could encode a video and it worked fast enough. But basically, the computer was tied up for half an hour, 15 minutes, or however long. Again, the great thing about having a Mac Pro is I hit encode in Final Cut, and then I come back here to Wirecast, and I start recording the next video. And then I get done with this video, I do the editing, I set that to encode, and then I can do the next video. But here's the thing. Most people don't need that. Most people are not encoding massive files while they're recording massive files and doing other things. And so if you really look at it for most users, I would argue this 2013 MacBook Pro is actually good enough. So if you start thinking about it, it's like, okay, well, if you buy a Mac now versus buy a Mac when you get the ARM processor, is the ARM processor going to be doing a tremendous amount more for you? Probably not. Probably, I think it's going to be like little things. It's kind of like the T2 chip. Right, again, so right now, one of the interesting things that Apple has done is they're creating multiple different processors for different things within these devices. So you have the CPU, you have the GPU possibly. Then you have things like the T2 chip. If you're dealing with the iPhone 11 Pro, you have something called the U1 chip. The U1 chip is like a directional type chip. And so they're adding all these different chips. So do I believe that when the new ARM processor MacBook comes out, that'll have some fancy new chip in it? Maybe it'll have some fancy audio chip to give you, I don't know, better sound, or have some, but is it really gonna matter? It's really gonna matter. Again, for a lot of people, when you're looking at your laptop, is an extra hour or two of battery time really gonna matter? For most people. Again, I have my laptop. I've taken my laptop literally all around the world. Let's be honest, most of the time I'm using my laptop as plugged in. So even if you get an extra 2 or 3 hours of battery time, which is nothing to sneeze at, is it really going to be that much more significant? I would argue probably not. So when I look at this, I think of this as much more of this is a way for Apple to be able to rein in their logistics process and overall create better systems. But I don't believe the ARM processors themselves will actually make the systems significantly better. Now, one of the questions to be asking yourself, though, is if you're sitting there and you're thinking about, it's like, well, should I buy an ARM processor now? If we know they're going to the ARM processors, should I wait to buy an ARM processor MacBook Pro? Because then I'll future-proof, right? Because obviously, when we deal with operating systems, so operating systems have to be designed to work on certain processors. So when you write an operating system to work on an x86 processor, an Intel processor, that is different coding than what's required on an ARM processor. And so one of the concerns people may have is that when Apple moved from the PowerPC to the Intel processor, after a certain amount of time, I think it was like 5 years, they stopped doing updates to the PowerPC operating systems. So basically, in a lot of ways, those PowerPCs, once they stopped getting the updates, they were no longer getting operating system updates in the whole 9 yards. One of the things that I would think about with the switch over to ARM processors is Tim Cook yesterday literally said the switch will take 2 years. When they say 2 years, we should probably say at least 2 years. At least 2 years. So the switch for Apple to move from Intel to ARM completely will be at least 2 years. So that gives you 2 years. And then if you look at support, they're most likely going to give 5 years of support at least past when they sell the final Intel processor. Because the last thing that they want to do, they can get a lot of complaints about people for price of computers, but one of the things with buying an Apple is, again, if you spend a lot of money on a MacBook Pro, 7 years later, it's still working great, right? There's a value proposition there. Apple doesn't want to have people spending $2,000 and $3,000 and $5,000 on systems, and then 2 or 3 years later, essentially having those systems become obsolete, and then you get a lot of pissed off people. So I would argue most likely you're going to get about 5 years at least past when they sell their final Intel processor before they actually drop full support. I don't even say full support for Intel processors. So we're looking at least 2 years. Plus about 5 years from that point. At this point, we're looking at most likely at least 7 years. And to be clear, when we talk about at least 7 years, that's at least 7 years of full updates. It's not necessarily the security updates and all that kind of stuff. And then one of the things you have to think about, like with me, when I look at my systems, is I basically use the same software I've been using for a long time. Let's be honest. I use Safari. I use Final Cut Pro. I use Wirecast. I use this weird little paint app that I use. I use Mail. It's kind of funny, right? You think about computers, and then you think about, like, what software do you actually use all the time? So let's say I have 4 or 5 pieces of software. Again, so for me, what's very important, Wirecast, absolutely need Wirecast. Final Cut, absolutely need Final Cut. But one of the things to be thinking about is even if Wirecast moves completely beyond the Intel processor. So again, 7 years from now, who the hell knows if I'm even going to be using Wirecast 7 years from now. But let's say I'm still using Wirecast 7 years from now. So Wirecast cuts off support for Intel processors. And let's say Apple, for Final Cut, cuts off support for Intel processors. One of the questions you do have to ask yourself, and again, this will be after 7 years of improvements from where we are now, how long will it be before the software that I'm using, that is no longer receiving updates, actually becomes functionally obsolete for me? Right, like I noticed that with Wirecast. So Wirecast updates, they come out with a new version every once in a while. But the reality is many times I'm running multiple versions of the past of Wirecast. Even though I pay for my support agreements, I can update whenever I want to update. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter. What does it do? It records video feeds with audio. Maybe I put some overlays or whatever else on the screen. The reality is the difference between Wirecast 8 and Wirecast 9 and Wirecast 13. Are the differences? Yeah. Do I know what the differences are? No. All right. So you think about 7 years in the future. 7 years in the future, all right, they get to Wirecast 24. And so it's like, okay, we are no longer supporting, Mac with Intel processors past Wirecast 24. How many years will it be before I give a crap? How many years before I'm like, oh, you know what I really need? I really need this one functionality that Wirecast came out with, so I guess I'm going to have to buy a new system. So I think that's one of the things to be thinking about here, because I know a lot of people are like really worried. It's like, oh no, like if they're going over to ARM, Then they're going to switch the operating system, all the software on ARM. How long is there going to be support for the Intel processors? But one of the things to be thinking about is back when they switched from PowerPC to Intel processors, there was a massive revolution for computers, right? Better screens, better processors, better internet service. I mean, like when you look at the PowerPC era of Apple systems to the Intel era of Apple systems, I mean, it's just it's Model Ts compared to Ferraris. I mean, it's just yeah, they've both got four wheels, but other than that, they're not really the same thing. But I would argue is when we start looking at the Intel generation of Apple computers, and then we start thinking about where the ARM computers will go, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, again, for end users, how much better is this going to be? How much better do you need your Safari, your web browser? How much better do you need all the software? Or is the reality, there's going to be some improvements, but realistically, there's not going to be a massive amount of improvements there. So that's where I'm thinking. Again, I just got this Mac Pro, literally just got this Mac Pro a little while ago. I love it. I don't care what the hell you say. You can say whatever the hell you want to say. I don't care. I love my Mac Pro. But anyways, I'm looking at my Mac Pro that I just got. And I honestly, heart of hearts, as a tech professional, I've been doing tech since 1996. I'm looking at this Mac Pro, and I honestly believe it's going to last me about 10 years. Again, if I look at this MacBook Pro, this is 7 years old right now, and it still works completely fine. Does everything I needed to do other than like video editing. And so I look at this Mac Pro, I think this is going to be fine for 10 years. Again, in 10 years, we'll have some fancy ARM processor doing what? Yeah, probably. But I don't think it's going to be something that I really need to jump ship and go for. So I think those are some of the things to be thinking about with this whole switch from Apple using Intel processors going to ARM. I think we'll get some new interesting devices out of Apple. I think we'll get some curious things out of Apple. I think for Apple products and production and logistics, I think going over to be ARM will be a good thing. I think honestly for most consumers, If your Mac dies, a year or two from now, buy an ARM Mac. Is it really going to be that big of a difference? Probably not for you. I don't think for the end user it's going to be that significant, and I also don't think for the end user, for most of us, it's something to be that worried about. The only way I would be a little bit concerned about it at all, again, if you're somebody to buy a Mac Pro, if you're somebody to buy an iMac Pro, if you're somebody to buy like the high end MacBook Pro, so if you're spending $6,000 for a MacBook Pro, then maybe concern yourself a little bit. But if you're going in and you're buying a mid-range, like a $2,000 MacBook Pro, even if there are modifications, even if there are changes within 5 years, I mean, after 5 years, if you're buying a $2,000 MacBook Pro, how many people are really planning to use that MacBook Pro at the 6 or 7 year mark anyway? So you know Apple is going to support everything for at least 5 years from today. And so at least, I would argue, most likely, reasonably, I think it's going to be at least 7. And so again, if you're looking at a $2,000 system, are you really thinking about 7.5 years from now whether there are going to be operating system updates for it? I would question that type of thing. So anyways, those are some of my thoughts. Those are my thoughts with Apple going over to ARM. It's one of those, good for them. Am I going to buy a new MacBook Pro? No. Am I going to buy a new Mac? Oh, hell no. Am I really going to buy anything new? No. I think it's just kind of one of those, like, yep, they're coming out with something new. Ooh. So anyhow, that's all I've got to say. That's all I've got to say for those very controversial, these very serious subjects. This is serious. ARM processors matter. So anyways, if you have any questions you would like me to take a look at, think about putting your question down in the comments down below. Maybe this is how we'll start doing the conversation. We'll do asynchronous communication. You can ask a question. I can decide whether I want to answer it. The ones I answer. Nobody gets their feelings hurt. Nobody goes home and cries. Nobody goes home and cries about my opinions about ARM processors. Nobody's like, I can't believe Eli said that about ARM processors. Oh. Oh, yeah. Or to be clear, if you do take it personally what I say about ARM processors, Yeah, that's the point that I give up. That's the point. I'm just like, I don't know, whatever. So, anyways, put your questions, put your comments, all of that, and down in the doobly doo. And with that, I will see you folks at the next video.